December the 31st. And now to our speaker, Mr. Richard Bifield, who's kindly agreed to talk to us today. Apart from a 30-year career on Wrekin Council, mostly as tourism manager, Richard has a wealth of knowledge about Shropshire, its history and all the rest of it. But today he's going to talk to us about the British on holiday. Can't wait.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Thank you very much for inviting me back here today. This is, as just been said, has arisen out of my work with Wrekin Council as it was when I joined it, Telford and Wrekin later on, of course. And when I left the council a few years ago, I thought it might be nice to actually look into the whole history of the subject of tourism. I've called this particular talk From the Grand Tour to Mass Tourism. The Grand Tour, as you probably know, is mainly around the 18th century. But the more you look into the history of the whole subject of tourism, the more distant you go back into history. In fact, you can go back much, much further than you might expect. We go back 2,000 years, and we can read about wealthy Athenians who travelled across the Mediterranean to visit the ruins of ancient Egypt. This is 2,000 years ago. In turn, wealthy Romans travelled to see the ruins of ancient Greece 2,000 years ago. This is Seneca, the Roman historian who lived at the time of Christ. 2,000 years ago, he was talking about this travel mania. Nothing new under the sun, folks, it would seem. But I think we can actually skip forward about 1,000 years, and most of the experts I've read suggest that the pilgrims were in fact the first real tourists. And you'll be surprised at some of the numbers we may be talking about. There were of course dozens, if not hundreds, of pilgrimage destinations in this country and in Europe in the medieval period. This of course is Canterbury Cathedral, which is probably the most important of our destinations for pilgrims. Of course they went to worship at the shrine of Thomas Becket. We mustn't call him Thomas à Becket anymore, it's Thomas Becket, we forget the A these days. And this, of course, is Geoffrey Chaucer, writer of the Canterbury Tales. Now, of course, we're talking about fictional accounts, but they're based on fact. And we read about Chaucer's wife of Bath being on pilgrimage 3 times to Jerusalem, as well as to Rome, Cologne and Compostela. Compostela, of course, being Compostela de Santiago in the northwest of Spain, still a really important destination today. Fictional accounts certainly were based on fact, and you can imagine in the 14th century, which is when he was writing, just how difficult those trips would be. We're not talking about weekends away here, folks. We're not talking about short breaks. We're talking about long periods of time. And of course, this particular, somebody here, I'm sure, would have been to Glastonbury, and the George Inn was specifically built to actually house pilgrims as a hostelry for them, visiting and worshipping at the Glastonbury Abbey. Built about 1470, about 60 years before everything changed. Everything changed courtesy of Henry VIII, the Reformation, when this country changed from being a Catholic country into a Protestant country. That changed things dramatically. This is Santiago de Compostela. This is the cathedral, a modern picture obviously. Just to give you an idea of those numbers, you actually had to get the king's permission in the medieval period to actually travel abroad on pilgrimage. And this tells us that in 1434, that 1 year alone, King Henry VI granted licenses for nearly 2,500 pilgrims from this country to go to Compostela, just bearing in mind that there were dozens, if not hundreds, of other destinations around the continent at the time. But let's move forward a couple of hundred years. I think we can look towards the Elizabethan period, the 16th century, as being the origins of the Grand Tour itself. This, of course, is the great lady herself, Queen Elizabeth I, and she was very keen for her young gentlemen courtiers to actually travel abroad so they could actually broaden their education, but actually, just as important for her, they could make diplomatic contacts with heads of state that were useful for her in her dealings with her fellow heads of state around Europe. One of her favourites was in fact a man with quite a strong Shropshire connection. You know the name, I'm sure. This is the fellow. We're talking about Sir Philip Sidney, of course, the poet soldier. And we talk about him when he travelled on his 3-year grand tour with 3 servants, 4 horses through the countries you can see there today, making those contacts which are going to be useful for his queen to actually develop later on. The Grand Tour essentially was for young aristocratic gentlemen. We are talking about gentlemen rather than gentlewomen here, folks. very few ladies would have actually gone abroad. The ones we do know would have written about them, but they're very much in the minority. They were there to gain experience in the classical arts, to broaden their education, and before they settled down to run the family estates. I'll use the gizmo if I get. The route was a fairly narrow one, actually. Here we are. Where are we? Am I getting a pointer here? No, I'm not. For some strange reason, the pointer is given up. Oh, it's not very good, is it? You can just about see. There we go. Just about. Crossing the channel. Not very easy for us to do now. We can go over or underneath it, of course. But there they would have gone through either the centre of France down there and across to Italy in that fashion, or they might have gone down the Rhone and crossed. The difficult crossing would of course be to get across the Alps. Their aim, of course, was to get to Italy. That was the goal. This is where the Mecca was for them in terms. This is the seat of the Renaissance, where the new things were happening in the world. Very few grand tourists went west to the Iberian Peninsula. Very few went east through Greece. Some did go through Greece, but nobody went much further, apart from Byron, of course, who actually travelled quite a lot around there. But having gone to Italy, they would have come back perhaps a different route. If they came down through France, they would have gone back up the Rhine through Germany and the Low Countries. And that was the general trend of things for the whole period of the Grand Tour. France, they got to, and of course what they were doing was they were visiting museums, they were visiting art galleries, they were meeting important people, and this is one place they would certainly have gone to, the Grand Gallery at the Louvre in Paris. And then through to Italy, as I say, that was the aim, to get to Italy. And by the time we get to the mid-18th century, although they were there essentially for cerebral reasons, it had become a refined form of pleasure. They had a really good time as well, in all sorts of ways, some of the ways they shouldn't have done. This is the Uffizi Gallery, and we see a group of grand tourists here actually looking at some of the pictures. And of course what happened on the Grand Tour is these young gentlemen spent money. Sometimes they spent too much money. They acquired paintings, they acquired furniture, they acquired statues, which would have been shipped back to their family homes in this country, or came back with them when they returned themselves. And they had their own portraits painted. In every town they stayed in, they would have had the local portrait painter paint an image of them, and that again would have gone back home. That's the Uffizi there. And Venice was a very popular spot for 2 or 3 reasons. I have to tell you folks that at the time we're talking about, there were 30,000 ladies of the town catering for visitors. And at the same time, I discovered very recently, there just happened to be 30,000 English grand tourists there at the same time. One situation. But certainly they would have gone there for the wonderful art and the architecture as well. And this is one of the famous pictures by Canaletto, who was the greatest view painter of the time. Great favourite of British tourists there. One of a suite of 24 pictures that were commissioned by the Duke of Northumberland, family seat, and in Castle up in Northumberland, of course. One of 24, and again, these would all have been shipped back to his houses. This chap was the son of that Duke. He became Duke in good turn. This is 1760 roughly, and we see, if we can, here we see a quadrant of the Colosseum, so we know we're in Rome. We see the young gentleman himself. He's got his dog here. He will have had servants with him, but they won't be in the pictures. But this chap is in the picture. Who is this chap? Well, in many cases, the young gentlemen abroad would have taken their college tutor with them, or a guardian. And these chaps went by the generic title of bear leaders. Their job was to actually look after the young gentleman, to make sure he went to the right places, saw the right museums, visited the right art galleries, met the right people, didn't get into trouble, didn't get drunk, didn't spend too much money. Sometimes they succeeded in that, sometimes they didn't. But so that's who that chap would be. He would, quite often, these young gentlemen would have been at college at either Oxford or Cambridge. And we've always been brought up, haven't we, to think that Oxford and Cambridge have always been at the forefront of universities throughout their life. Well, in the 18th century, they were at a fairly low ebb. And many students at either Oxford or Cambridge did actually complete and improve their studies by going to universities abroad, either Paris or Bologna or Prague, in one of the great European universities. And sometimes they were there for a term, 2 terms, even a complete year, to actually expand their education. Naples was the goal. We're talking about 100 years before reunification reunification of Italy, should I say. Naples was a bigger city than Rome. It was a more important city. And this was really where the folks stayed for 3 or 4 months and then started to return. They made their return journey, having seen Naples. They went, of course, to see the fabled Bay of Naples itself. They went to see Vesuvius, and if it was erupting at the time, that was a nice bonus for their trip, obviously. And at the same time, of course, Herculaneum and Pompeii were being excavated, and that, of course, was a great attraction for that particular city. Let's have a look at numbers. I'm not going to bombard you with numbers, but it's interesting to see just what we're talking about. By the end of the 18th century, more than 40,000 English visitors were on the continent at any one time. And they came home with the spoils. This is one room in a man called Townley, who was a Lancashire industrialist, but this is his Mayfair home, and he's actually showing off to his envious friends, I guess, some of the goodies he brought back from his grand tour. And one can imagine other rooms were filled like this, and perhaps his Lancashire house was similarly filled with statues and books and furniture and paintings. We don't have to go that far. We've got a local example here we can quote. Some of you, if not all of you, will recognise this as Attingham Park, not too far from here. And of course what we've got in here is the story of the second Lord Berwick, who went on his grand tour right at the end of the 18th century. And he came back with such a lot of goodies that he hired this chap here, John Nash, the great architect planner, to actually create that art gallery which we see today in the middle of Attingham Park. You probably know the story that, of course, when he came back to this country, he continued spending, which was an unfortunate thing to do because he soon ran out of money. He was declared bankrupt, and everything he brought back from Italy as part of his grand tour had to be sold to pay his debts. And this is not an isolated example. I've come across several others. So the bear leaders didn't always succeed in their jobs to actually keep their young charge on the straight and narrow, and here's a local example of that. Travelling in Britain, and let's have a look to see. I think we can say that our health spas were perhaps our first resorts, and some of them go back to the late 16th century. We know the names of many of them, some of them are very close to us here, but I guess this is the most famous of them all. Obviously it had a Roman origin, but this is Bath, who I'm sure a number of you will have been to. There were many others, and I think they were classed really as our first resource, inland resource, except of course when we get to Scarborough. That of course was a spa on the coast, and we'll come to Scarborough in a minute. This is really quite important. When we think today, where should we take our friends, or where should we go on holiday in this country, we head for the hills, don't we? We know automatically that Mid Wales, North Wales, the Lake District, Scotland Highlands are wonderful, beautiful places and attractive places to visit. This is natural. Why do we question it? Well, this wasn't the thought of people before the middle of the 18th century. Those places I've just announced would have been places you would have avoided. These were people by nasty, sinister people. The roads there were absolutely impossible, and you would not have gone out of pleasure, unless you really had to the Highlands of Scotland, to the Lake District, or to North Wales. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that, don't forget, 1789, the French Revolution, immediately followed by the Napoleonic Wars, cut off, in many cases, the continent from us. Our grand tourists could no longer go and travel around Europe. It was unsafe, in fact, in many cases dangerous to do so. And at the same time as they were sort of restricted to this country, we see the growth of writings about these parts of the country that we now know as beautiful. And we're talking, of course, about people like this chap here, William Wordsworth, up in the Lake District. This is Grasmere, this is Dove Cottage in Grasmere. Some of you, I'm sure, will have been there. He was extolling the virtues with his fellow Lakeland poets of that wonderful part of the country. Scotland, as I say before, the Victorian period really was a place you would have avoided, but with the writings of this chap, Sir Walter Scott, the favourite writer of Queen Victoria, that promoted the Highlands of Scotland as a place to visit, as an attractive place. Queen Victoria fell in love with the country after reading the works of Walter Scott, and of course she created the Balmoral estate there. Where royalty goes, the aristocrats follow. Where the aristocrats go, the rest of us eventually follow as well. And that's actually created the interest in these places that hitherto were not visited. Seaside resorts, you're wondering when on earth are we going to get to the seaside? Because for British on holiday, we've always gone to the seaside. Back to Scarborough. From what I've read, I reckon it can be, I think it can claim to be the first of our resorts. I'll show you in a minute. But really, visiting seaside resorts was very popular later on in the 18th century by royalty once more. But this is Scarborough, and this print is of 1735, as early as that. And if I can get the thingy to work again, there we go. What are we looking at here? We're looking at a bathing machine. Now, a bathing machine, this was a Scarborough invention, and over the next, 150, right up to the early years of the 20th century, bathing machines could be seen around all our coastal resorts, but they started off life in Scarborough in the early years of the 18th century. But it's this chap, George III, advised by his doctors to go down to the south coast, who actually really popularised, for medicinal purposes, of course, for health reasons, to actually take the waters. And he went to Weymouth, which Malcolm Regis we're talking about here. And what that says, if you can't read it, it says George III's first bathe at Weymouth, 1789. In fact, on the front of Weymouth, you can still see George III's bathing machine is still there as an object to see. And of course, he popularised that place, and it's been a fashionable resort ever since. A few decades later, his son, then Prince of Wales, soon to become George IV, of course, fell in love with another part of the south coast, Brighton, and that's the Constable picture of Brighton. And of course, this is him, like his father a few years before, the Prince Regent, it says here, entering a bathing machine at Brighton, 1818. And again, John Nash, who worked at Attingham Park, was employed by the Prince to develop the amazing Brighton Pavilion. And of course, the quality from London flocked down to Brighton, and it has been a popular resort for all classes, of course, ever since. Back to the London area, and with the growth of steam navigation in the early years of the 19th century, we see resorts close to London, Margate and Ramsgate, gaining popularity. Look at those numbers, 100,000 visitors a year in the 1830s went there from London by Thames steamers. Country house visiting. Now, I've shown you a picture of Attingham Park, and you perhaps might think, well, this is a fairly recent phenomenon of us visiting stately homes, as we still tend to call them. But again, that tradition goes back at least a couple of hundred years. You'd be surprised, perhaps. This is that lovely National Trust property called Kedleston Hall, which is very close to Derby, one of the great Adam buildings, home of the Curzon family. And it was quite normal for a house even as grand as this to actually accept visiting parties as long as you were of the right class. The leader of that party would be writing to the housekeeper, not the family, write to the housekeeper and arrange a date for his party to visit. And it was quite normal for that in a number of stately homes, as we still call them, from the mid-years of the 18th century onwards. This is Mrs. Garnett, who was the housekeeper of Kedleston Hall. She knew the house so well that she actually wrote the first guidebook to it, and this is what she's holding there. And this is what she used when she actually guided Boswell and Johnson around in the mid-1770s. Now, this is again quite an important landmark here. Early 19th century, right up until the end of the 18th century, despite the growth of turnpike trusts, the road situation in this country was really very bad indeed. It was very difficult, very slow travelling around the country by road. This is why canals were so important. It wasn't until we get to the growth of improvements in the early 19th century, courtesy of my great hero Thomas Telford and his fellow engineers, that we actually see big changes. This is the man himself, of course, as you know, don't need me to tell you he was the first county surveyor of this county. And this, of course, is one of his milestones just across the way from Charles Darwin's birthplace, the Mount, showing you that 106 miles in that direction gets you to the end of the road. End of the road, of course, being Holyhead. And from Shropshire up to Holyhead, it was really a brand new road. And when it was completed, it was reckoned to be the best road, not just in this country, but in the whole of Europe. And the reason for him actually to do that work was that it all stemmed from the Act of Unification with Ireland in 1800. Prior to 1800, the Irish MPs had their own parliament in Dublin. After 1800, Irish MPs had to come to Westminster, which meant they had to take that trip from Holyhead down to London. And it was an appalling trip for them to make. And from 1800 to 1815, they were continually complaining to Westminster about the state of the Holyhead Road. In a good season, it would take them 2 or 3 days. In a bad winter season, it might take them 4 or 5 to actually make that trip. So in 1815, Thomas Telford was actually commissioned by the government to actually survey and make improvements to the road. And from Shropshire up to the Holyhead Road, virtually a brand new road. and this is the start of it there. This is the Abbey, of course, and that particular stretch of the Holyhead Road, which you'll know very well indeed, was the very last stretch of the Holyhead Road to be completed in 1836, driving through the remains of the Abbey precincts, 2 years in fact after Thomas Telford died. He died in 1834. And of course it's one of his great masterpieces, linking the mainland with the island of Anglesey, the Menai Suspension Bridge. I'm sure a number of you know that, one of the great engineering feats of that era. And what road improvements in that period brought in was the golden age of stagecoach travel, which you can see was a fairly narrow period, but the sort of Dickensian pictures we're so fond of seeing here. Roads were made safer, travel was quicker, but it was never cheap to travel by stagecoach, even if you were exposed to the elements on the top there. Just a few more pictures here. You could even take a steam coach from London to Bath there. We'll come in a few minutes to the great Thomas Cook, but just to give you an idea of the cost, when he was an old man, he actually wrote to one of his friends accounting to him what the cost of travel was when he was a very young man. And he was saying to his friend in this letter, I had occasion to travel from Edinburgh to London when I was a young man, and the fee was 14 guineas, which was 1/2 my year's salary for that particular year, for that one trip. So as I say, it was safer, it was quicker, but it was never cheap. And of course, what stopped the golden age in its tracks, almost literally, was the dawning of the railway age. And that was a revolution. It gave rise to great art. Obviously, this is the Frith painting of Paddington Station. It gave rise to song sheets. But what it did do here was to actually open up travel to many, many more people that hitherto could never afford to actually travel beyond their own little town or village. This is a lovely painting you'll see in Birmingham Art Gallery, and the title of this painting gives you exactly the change that it made to the average person. 14 guineas, remember that figure, 14 guineas from Edinburgh down to London. The title of this is To Brighton and Back for 3 and 6pence, because that's what it costs to go third class. You can imagine the difference that made to the average person. But not everybody was in favour of the working classes travelling. Railways might act as a premium to the lower orders to go uselessly wandering about the country, said the Duke of Wellington. And railways encouraged a dangerous tendency towards equality. And quite seriously, the royalty, and more in particular the aristocrats of London, were not happy about cheap travel, because they really did think quite seriously that cheap travel by rail would actually encourage working class people to come down from the nasty industrial Midlands in the north to the capital and create havoc and mayhem. Don't forget, when we talk about the Great Exhibition, which is a particular period when they were concerned, it's only 3 years after the Great Revolutionary Year of 1848, when there were revolutions all over Europe. And there was a great fear in this country, what with the charters, that this would happen here. So, we laugh now, but it wasn't funny for them at the time. And of course, when we came to the Great Exhibition, and we'll come in a minute, we'll find that their fears were unfounded. Thomas Cook, 1841, first organised trip from Leicester out to Loughborough, a temperance trip, created the Thomas Cook Empire, which still exists today. The Cook's Excursionist was the Bible of the middle-class traveller. And of course, what Cook did was they really brought organised travel down to the middle classes, and they went by train. This is 1851, and he's the printer of this particular sheet here, which tells you that to get from York to London and back for £1, so you travel third class, 5 shillings. Yes, you could pay 15 shillings for your first class trip, but it went down to the Great Exhibition and back again for just 5 shillings. You can imagine the difference that made to many people. And that, of course, is the Crystal Palace of Joseph Paxton in what's now Hyde Park. And if you look closely, you can just see what still remains, in fact. Have I got it down there? Yeah, just about. These are the Coalbrookdale gates, which were an integral part of the Crystal Palace, which you can still be seen today. Actually, they form part of the division between Kensington Gardens and Hyde Park. If you're close to Albert Hall, you're very close to the Coalbrookdale gates. Just a little bit of a local aside there. Holiday tours, Cook's Ticket, Scottish Tourist, And don't forget, later on in the century, it was Thomas Cook and Henry Lunn, the name we still remember today. They invented the winter sports trade, developing, not developed by the local people, developed by British entrepreneurs. Famous places like Chamonix and Klosters and other world-famous resorts. And as early as the 1870s, Thomas Cook was running a flotilla of craft up and down the River Nile for his middle-class people. He could take you to the Great West, to Alaska, or he could take your party to the local cup final. Wherever you wanted to go, Thomas Cook could organise a trip for you. In the middle of the 19th century, those figures are going up all the time. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, those numbers can grow. Europe is open again to travellers, getting up to 100,000 a year. And back to this country, of course, at our resorts, we see the growth of small B&Bs, bigger guest houses, and major hotel development from the 1850s onwards. This one is still existing. This is the Grand Hotel at Scarborough. I gave this talk a few weeks ago, and the lady said, I've just come back from a holiday there, built by a chap called Cuthbert Broderick, who built the wonderful Leeds Town Hall. This is another Scarborough hotel, the Royal. This is the original Imperial Hotel at Torquay. It's a new Imperial on the site now, and still to be seen in Brighton, the Metropole on the left and the Grand Hotel on the right. So major hotel development for the leisure traffic, and piers, of course, to provide entertainment for those visitors. This is Blackpool, and we've got Brighton, we've got Eastbourne there. If you've ever wondered which is the oldest seaside pier, I can now tell you. I was actually raised on the Isle of Wight. I wasn't born there, but I was raised on the Isle of Wight, and my very first job was in fact in tourism. When I was at school still, I was a kitchen porter at one of Pontin's holiday camps. Anybody remember Pontin's holiday camps? Believe me, you don't get lower than a kitchen porter at a holiday camp. But if any of you have been to the Isle of Wight, you might well have actually travelled from Portsmouth to Ryde. And Ryde claims, with justification, to be the oldest pier in the country. Originated in 1813, as early as that. Most piers actually were developed from the 1850s onwards, but Ryde goes back to 1813. So next time you're at a general knowledge quiz and that question comes up, and of course Seaside Entertainments with those piers. Piero show down there, and minstrel show there, whatever the weather was, because this was the only form of entertainment, they were always guaranteed a good crowd. And of course, latterly, in the back end of the 19th century, the growth of postcards. Interesting enough, it wasn't until 1894 that the Royal Mail allowed picture postcards to go through the mail. The Americans did it at least 20 or 30 years before then. This is one of these standard postcards, just a wish you were here type postcard, just happens to be from Portree, Isle of Skye. But in the early years of the 20th century, we get humorous postcards. Do you remember the seaside postcards? Some of which could be quite rude, couldn't they? You'll be pleased, I'm not going to show you the rude ones, but or perhaps you're disappointed. But I could, that sort of thing, that sort of thing. And of course, the great Rembrandt of the picture postcard was Donald McGill, and that was one of his. And of course, these small towns on the coast, some of them only villages, grew up when the railways reached them, and tourism was in many cases their main industry, so they promoted it like crazy through posters like this. Scarborough braces you up, the air does it, it says there. A more recent one, this is Aberystwyth, perhaps dating to the 50s, I think. But perhaps the most famous poster of them all was Skegness. Skegness is so bracing, by which it means cold, but bracing sounds like but that's probably the most famous poster of all. And we saw these posters all over the country, especially in railway stations, because that's how people travel to their destination of choice by train. Back to the continent, it is becoming more accessible, but still mainly for the well-heeled. And of course, a lot of our steam companies, our railway companies, were linked with the steam navigation company. So we see this poster here which tells us to step on at Grimsby for the continent. And this one here by the Great Eastern Railway says basically step on for the continent at Harwich. Don't go to Grimsby, come to our boats at Harwich. And if you had a lot of money and you wanted to go to Paris or Venice or perhaps even as far as Istanbul, then maybe the Orient Express was the way to go. Two classic lines. The most important one was the red one there, which actually took you down through Paris Venice, and then along to Istanbul. You could carry on to the Holy Land there. I was lucky enough when I was a student in the mid-60s to actually take that route there, the northern route there. I remember getting on the train at Victoria 10:30 Saturday night, and getting off the train at Istanbul 4:30 the following Tuesday afternoon. So it was quite a long train journey. But it was I still remember the price. It was £17, which I could afford then. That included couchettes and all meals. Brilliant, absolutely. Wow. Quite an experience, that one. We've talked about our spas, which date back to as far back as the 16th century, but continental spas, especially in the latter part of the 19th century, very popular with royalty and aristocrats, of course. Edward VII's favourite, who I think was Baden-Baden in Germany there, but there were many, many others. Sea cruising, which is now a very big part of the tourism market, when it started strictly for the affluent, and it started in 1900. The first purpose-built cruise liner was that one there, launched by the Hamburg America shipping line. And just a few pictures there. Obviously you can tell we're in Venice there with the gondola in the foreground, and the P&O excursion being advertised there in North Africa. The interwar period is important, but visiting the country in Seaside is starting to become within reach of most families. And they're going by train, of course they're going by train, and some of the advertising at the time, get away from the chimneys. This was aimed at people living in the industrial Midlands and the North, saying get away from your smoky environment, come out into the nice clean countryside by our train. Similarly here, Midland Railway, we're actually aiming this at people living in Nottingham and Leicester and Derby, come into the wonderful clean air of the Peak District, courtesy of the Midland Railway. I like this one because it says, by underground into the country for nature's playgrounds, and one of the playgrounds is Golders Green and Wimbledon. So things have changed a bit, they've got a bit more built up. So everyone was getting in on the act. This was taken quite locally. You can just perhaps make out that this was taken at Hampton Load Station on the preserved Severn Valley line. And we used to see these posters at railway stations, not just at the stations, but actually inside our carriage. Do you remember when we actually had corridor trains? Often a little picture above our seat, as was a picture of the destination that train was going to take us to, because this is the way these towns promoted themselves. And of course they went by car and motorbike as well. There's some nice Morgans there. And Smith's Crisps were advertising holiday tours by car, and of course the SA go by motorbike as well. Biking and hiking, very important from the early years of the 20th century, and there was a lot of bike clubs started up then. The Tramper and Cyclist of 1934. And of course the Youth Hostel Association, gave very basic but very cheap accommodation to people who perhaps had never been out into the open countryside before. That started in 1930, 1931. And holiday camps, I've mentioned Pontins, but of course the biggie was Billy Butlin, and that's quite an important logo. A week's holiday for a week's pay, that's a week's holiday for the whole family for the pay of the breadwinner. I think 1936 saw the first of Billy Butlin's holiday camps at Skegness, I think it was. Anybody here been into a Butlin's holiday camp?
Yes.
That'd be great. Okay, well let's see if we've got your picture here. Do you recognise it? I don't know if any of the ladies got it. Early calisthenics there. It's a little bit more luxurious now, I think. And camping and caravanning, and some of the early campsites were a bit on the basic side, as you can imagine. You've got the camps there. They turned railway carriages into camping coaches. That's one there. A whole phalanx of disused buses. That's a campsite. And even up into the 1960s, a lot of caravans there. Pre-landscaping, I think this. I think our campsite. This is Weymouth, by the way. I think our campsites are better landscaped now. At least I hope they are. And Charabanc and coach touring, of course. That was important. This sort of thing here. Touring Britain by coach. Wakes, probably a works outing there, I should imagine. But when we get into the 50s, after the Second World War, we're finding our local coach companies taking us not just to the Isle of Wight or to Wales or to Scotland. It's venturing abroad. The one is the East Kent Company. That's a picture of Innsbruck. It's taking you over the continent. Remember, all the prices used to be in guineas. They were always in guineas, weren't they, for these coach tours? But still, and I guess right up until the 70s, the seaside's still the main holiday destination for families, for British people. I wish I'd taken that picture, but that's not what I want. That was from the Picture Post of 1938. I think you can still find Punch and Judy on some beaches, can't you? I mean, I can imagine a place like Rhyl would have a Punch and Judy perhaps in high season. Cleethorpes there. This is important as well. Just after the Second World War, 1948 holidays with pay act. What did that mean? That meant that by 52, 2/3 of manual workers had 2 weeks paid holiday a year. You can imagine the difference that made the ability of a family to get away. And then, of course, we get into the period which dominates travel now, the period of air travel, literally shrinking the globe. Now, we might not have thought it at the time, but in the 60s and 70s, Spain was really the mecca. And this is an amazing fact which I still have difficulty in understanding and believing, but it's true because I've checked on a few occasions. In the 70s, for every 20 British people that went abroad on holiday, 19 went to Spain. Can you imagine? It was that dominant in the market. And in many cases, the resorts along the Klosters that we're so familiar with now were actually created by the English entrepreneurs, and the English market drew the development there. I think that's important to know that we had that ability to travel abroad cheaper than a German family or a Scandinavian family or a Dutch family. We might not have thought so at the time, but the entrepreneurialism of our main outgoing industry enabled us to get to the Mediterranean cheaper than any of those other countries. Of course, it had a downside. If we were really good at sending our people abroad, that meant that our own resorts, which had been relying on our local trade, were actually suffering, declining in popularity, because people were thinking, wait a minute, we've always gone to Brighton or to Bournemouth, look at these prices in Benidorm. They're cheaper, I can stay in Benidorm cheaper than I can stay in Brighton, and I know the weather's going to be better. And that actually started the decline in popularity of our seaside resorts, which continues, I guess, to this day. And budget airlines, of course, didn't help matters in that way. Travel at giveaway prices. Now, who's this chap here? Anybody remember him? Freddie Laker, that's right. He was the fellow that started it all. Why did people fly with Laker? There's another picture there. Just to give you one example, his fare from Heathrow to New York was 1/3 the BOAC fare. That's why people went with Laker. He's no longer around, but of course what he started gave rise to Ryanair, EasyJet, and all the other low-cost carriers that we're so used to today. And of course the Channel Tunnel makes direct access to the continent possible, something our forefathers couldn't necessarily have foreseen. This is taken at Waterloo, but of course the terminus now is St Pancras, a wonderful station. Until a few years ago, I've still got this friend, but he lived in Canterbury, and this friend of mine, until a few years ago, had business in Paris and in London. He lived in Canterbury. And he was telling me, until a few years ago, it was quicker for him to get from Canterbury to Paris than it was from Canterbury to London, courtesy of the Eurostar and the poor nature of the local train system in Kent. But that's changed now, I'm glad to say. So we see I think the end of the era of the standard traditional 2-week family holiday. And so how does the British tourism market actually tackle this decline in business? It starts to promote short breaks. It actually starts promoting parts of the country that have never been promoted to the leisure visitor before. They've been places that perhaps have attracted business visitors. We're talking towns and cities here, some industrial cities. They now actually turn towards promoting themselves as leisure destinations. We'll see how in a minute. We're looking at heritage, industrial, cultural tourism, museums, art galleries, theatres, theme parks. In other words, we're sort of turning away from our coastal attractions, actually trying to promote our inland attractions, to try and keep people in. We recognise, the industry recognises that most families are still going to be able to go abroad cheaper than they can actually go to our seaside resorts. But they're promoting inland resorts and say, look, have a few short breaks in this country. We know you're going to go to the Mediterranean for your big holiday, but don't forget this country, we've got some really good places to visit for your short break. Beamish, this is industrial. Beamish up in the northeast, wonderful industrial heritage museum in County Durham. Big Pit down in South Wales, not a million miles from here. New Lanark in Scotland. Peace Hall in Halifax. We don't have to go that far. We've got the biggest and the best industrial heritage just around the corner, of course, in Ironbridge itself. National Trust, we've seen a picture already. National Trust membership of over 4 million people. Extraordinary. That's Attingham, of course. We've got a good clutch around here. Anybody recognise that one? Bensall Hall, just across the river from Iron Bridge, very close to Broseley. Sunnycroft in the middle of Wellington. Do you know Sunnycroft? If not, you should, even if you're not a National Trust member. Wonderful place. Intact since 1900. And Dudmaston Hall on the way from Bridgnorth down to Kidderminster. So as I say, we're well off for National Trust properties. City breaks. As I say, places that hitherto had actually promoted themselves as business centres are now starting to look to the tourism leisure market. Birmingham, a prime example, as the wonderfully renovated Town Hall, one of my favourite buildings in the Midlands, promoting itself on the back of its cultural offer, its museums, its art galleries, its theatre, its opera, its ballet. No disrespect to Liverpool, but until the Albert Docks area was developed to a wonderful extent, people would have gone there on business, but they wouldn't necessarily have gone to Liverpool as a leisure break, but now they do in great numbers. And even more so, no disrespect at all to Gateshead, but you wouldn't have gone to Gateshead 20 years ago as a leisure visitor. But now, with the growth of their cultural facilities there, linked with Newcastle, which is where I'm taking the photograph from here, it's a sort of two-centre holiday, it's got a strong leisure tourism promotion activity now. TV and film-related tourism. Well, when a TV show, a serial, especially a long-running serial, or a particular film, is based on a geographical part of this country, in many cases that part of the country will actually promote itself on the back of that TV show or film. These just happen to be all in Yorkshire, just happen to be purely coincidental. Holmforth Summer Wine Country, you know, last of the summer wine. Herriot Country, all creatures great and small, still in Yorkshire. Discover Heartbeat Country, again, this is the prime promotional activity of that particular locality on the back of that TV show. And it goes right up to date as well, still showing today, and it'll be on the TV tonight. Broadchurch, you might have seen that programme there based on Dorset. There is now a Broadchurch tour you can take. The TV show is still on, but the local tourism people there can actually take you around the sites where it was filmed. So that's really quite an important part of the way these things are being developed. And when a particular building is actually at the heart of a popular show on TV, then after it's shown the numbers grow dramatically. Now this is Lyme Park in Cheshire, National Trust property, and fellas, you can look away for the next picture because this one is strictly for the ladies. You know what I'm going to show you. That's the chap there. So this is the famous Connie. I haven't got him here in person, I'm sorry about that. I've got his picture there. But the serious point is that, you know, after Pride and Prejudice, because that's what we're talking about, after Pride and Prejudice was shown, the numbers going to Lyme Park increased dramatically, and they're still way up. And of course, just for fun, over the last few years, the growth of theme parks such as Thorpe Park down in the southeast, and of course the biggest and the best, Alton Towers up in our part of the country there. As well as budget travel, we've got budget hotels, a dramatic growth in the growth of budget hotels. This is the hotel at the M54 service station at Telford. £55 it was then. You can now get a room there for 29. And recently, you know, we're talking about the travel lodges, we're talking about the Premier Inns, we're talking about Days Inn. This time last year, my wife and I went to the Travel Inn at Portmaddock. £19 a night it cost. So it's £9.50 each. The dog cost another £10. So you can imagine. And compared to what hotel prices were 20 or 30 years ago, dramatic reduction. And this again is really important, I think. How do we book our holidays now? Fanciful aside time. Take your mind back to the 70s. We're watching television on Christmas Day. We may be watching the Morecambe Wise special. Following day we might switch over to ITV. Now what were the adverts showing on ITV from Boxing Day onwards? They were all holiday adverts. Do you remember? This is where we used to get our ideas for what we were going to do in the summer if we had the ability to go abroad. We would see what we would see on the TV, and we'd go to our local travel agent when the shops were open and say, I've seen something on television, can you actually talk me through it or show me the brochure? And that's how it was done. They used to do it for you. Is that still the same way we do it now? I suggest more and more of us are actually going online at home. We're using our own home computer. We're cutting out the middleman, in fact. We're actually doing our own booking. We book our travel, we book our cars, we book our excursions, we book our insurance, all online. We're cutting out the middleman, which is why you can still see travel agents in the high street, but in many cases there's nobody there in terms of the queue, and there used to be queues at travel agent stations, but not anymore. And latterly, we've seen the growth of individual and speciality tourism. The family no longer goes away as a family, especially a family with teenagers. The last thing teenagers want to do is to go away with their parents. They want to go away with their friends. And in fact, gap years are really important. 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 children leaving school before they go on to further education will take a whole year as a gap year. And they travel in that gap year. And they're not going to Europe, they're going through Europe perhaps. They're going to Southeast Asia, they're going to Australasia, they're going to South America. The world is very definitely their oyster. And they get involved in, of course, things that I would be scared of, things like whitewater rafting and bungee jumping, that sort of thing. But it's not just the youngsters who've got these opportunities opening out for them. It's people of all sorts of ages, the different sorts of holidays you can take. It's no longer just sightseeing. Or, the pursuits that you've got, photography, art, cooking, bridge, chess, you can do it all over the world. There are organisations that actually are running holidays all over the world for all these different activities that we can be interested in. Modern cruising, let's go back to that, because currently it's the fastest growth sector of all, and growing at 10% per year. And I was looking at this not so long ago. It was the front cover of the Cunard Voyages programme, 2009 to 11. And I thought, that image rings bells with me. And then in one of my books I came across this poster for the Normandy, which of course was the most romantic way to actually cross the Atlantic in the 1930s. So clearly what Cunard are doing is to actually say, look, come on board one of our ships, and we'll take you back to the romantic age of the 1930s, courtesy of this particular poster. The decline continues. Traditional seaside resorts, even the major ones, even the Brightons, the Blackpools, the Bournemouths, are declining in terms of their leisure visitors. And what they're seeing is they're actually turning more to business, they're turning to conventions, trade associations, that sort of thing, to fill their hotel bedrooms. The Metropole, built for the leisure trade, now essentially is a hotel for people going to conferences at the adjacent Brighton Centre, similarly to the Grand Hotel on the other side. This is the end. I was trained actually, before I went into tourism, I was trained as a town planner, but I was never very good at looking at the future. I was always much better in looking at the past. So I'm, like you, wondering where do we go from here? Because I think there are a number of issues, a number of questions about the future of tourism. I've talked about aviation. I've talked about cheap aviation fuel, and sometimes we see ridiculous prices on these low-cost airlines. Can that be sustained for very much longer? And are we going to have that much oil for very much longer? There could well be an energy crisis up ahead, which may change the nature of travel. Environmental issues. We read about people going to third world countries, to South Sea Islands, staying in 5-star hotels, showering 3 or 4 times a day, when we know the local people there haven't perhaps even got clean water to drink. Can that be sustained for much longer? You don't need to be told about this, terrorism threat. I was giving this talk, I must admit, it was about 3 years ago, because 3 years is an important date. And at the end of the talk, somebody actually said, if you want to know a country to go to, it's absolutely wonderful. The food is lovely, the people are wonderful, the history there, the heritage there is to die for. And I said, fine, tell me where that is. And she said, we've just come back from Syria. Even people are refusing to go to Egypt now. And the poor people that actually, we've seen the picture of Thomas Cook actually with his flotilla of ships up and down the Nile. The people running those trips now have got no business at all. People are afraid to go to Egypt, at least that part of Egypt. They'll go to the Red Sea coast, but they will not go to inland Egypt. So terrorism is an issue, I'm afraid. So what's the answer, folks? Well, I don't know. Is it virtual tourism? Do we actually stay in our own room? Look at these places on our computer. Maybe we'll get a computer in the future which actually gives us the smell of that country. I really don't know. So I'm in the dark just as you are. All I would say is if you have a holiday planned for the next few months or sometime this year, bon voyage. Thank you very much.
What's the most interesting
Shropshire's the most interesting place, of course, isn't it? I was paid to stay there for many years. Do you know, I don't have a particular favourite. I love Venice. And I think the time to go to Venice is January and February, when there are few people there. And it doesn't really matter what the weather's like. You've got the place to yourself in January and February. So if I was to choose, I would say Venice.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mr. Bifield, Richard, for that wonderful gallop through history. And it's quite sobering to think that, you know, when you did your first adventure flying to Spain in the 1960s, we're just a little part of that tourism history. We weren't doing anything extraordinary at all. I didn't know at all about the London highway through Shrewsbury right out to Anglesey there at all. That's new to me. And thank you for putting right for me the conundrum about reading Jane Austen. I could never figure out why Elizabeth and her family went and were allowed to look round Pemberley by the housekeeper, and I thought it was a plot device just so Colin Firth could get out of the shirt. So thank you for that. In fact, we're almost full today, and our next meeting will be the 16th of March, and these talks are getting more and more popular. Maybe we should emulate the Germans, get up at the crack of dawn, spread your beach towel on your seat to save it. Okay, until next time, thank you very much, everyone.